reserving one for them, so she can get two.
Nope.
Nope. Okay.
We don't have enough.
And then we'll call you. I'll put your name again.
Better there than here.
Really? Okay, so I'm gonna need, and then when the blueberries, it's hot over, right? How much would I need for? Usually you want a whole bag, like if you look at a bag. For each one? Per blueberry, yeah. Okay, because you really want a lot of that soil around here.
Okay, good morning. I'll pass out some handouts first. Just put some on the chairs next to you. Or I'll just let you pass them toward the back there.
Got lots of Women's Day.
I may blush more, huh? How many of you have not been to my soil talk yet? Okay, so most, just about everybody. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about how to grow plants properly, how to manage a garden properly, and there's a lot of information to cover. So one of the big problems we have in our industry is that, and my advantage is I'm a second generation nurseryman. My father was a nurseryman when I was born. I've got a third generation on the way. My daughter's in the business too. So we've been in business a long time, and I did not learn how to garden from the universities. And unfortunately, the whole country has been led astray for the last 40 years the wrong way how to garden, and it just drives us nuts that no one has fixed the problem yet. So we'll be talking about that first, about what real dirt really is. First, let's talk a little bit about what plants need from the dirt, so you know what's going on here. So if you take a plant say a tree. When I was in elementary school or in high school, and not in college, but in high school, they used to show diagrams of trees where the roots were a mirror image of the top. They said the roots go down real deep, there's a taproot and all that. Well, we know that most of that was proven incorrect in the last 30, 40 years. The Forest Department has gone around the country digging up trees in the United States, throughout the world, and what they find is the roots are very surface oriented. They rarely go below 2 feet. In cities, they rarely go below 1 foot, and that's because of what the roots need to survive. So what roots need from the dirt, number one, they need moisture. When a tree is, or any plant is actively growing, they get their moisture from the roots. So plants generally lose water through holes in their leaves as they're photosynthesizing. They have to have their pores open and the water just evaporates out of there. They don't use a whole lot of water. They use water to make sugar, but most of it is lost to the air as evaporation. So they have to replace the roots. Now the plant in general above the ground is covered in wax, so it's waterproof except for the holes in the leaves. The roots aren't. They're in contact with the soil. The soil's got to be moist in order for the roots to get the water out of them. If the soil gets bone dry, the plant will wilt really quickly, especially on a warm, sunny day. Generally, you know, if you have a plant, you pull out of the dirt, you expose the roots to the sun on a hot day. Within an hour, it's wilted. Within 3 or 4 hours, it could be totally dead. So the soil has to provide moisture, so that's critical. The soil's got to be a reserve of moisture. Number two, though, we don't think about enough, and that's oxygen. So, like with us, we breathe through our mouth and throat. Our blood circulates the oxygen throughout our bodies. Plants don't have that system. So in a typical plant, anything that's green is making oxygen. The chloroplasts in the leaves and the stems that are green, that's the only part of the plant that makes oxygen. There are little tiny organelles within the cells that make it. The rest of the plant's consuming oxygen, just like we do. The rest of the plant has to consume oxygen to create energy and survive. The roots especially, they need oxygen. So the one thing that's not mentioned enough or not considered enough is that the roots have to get air. That's why they can't grow very deep, because the air doesn't penetrate the ground very deeply. Now, roots don't need as much oxygen as we do. I mean, if you buried yourself a foot in the ground, you'd be dead in 5 minutes. Roots need a lower amount of oxygen. And actually, tap water out of the faucet has enough oxygen in it. So the water districts know this. They've been told that water requires about 6 to 8 parts per million. So for every million water molecules, there has to be 6 to 8 parts per million parts of oxygen molecules in that water with it. So that's why if you go to a water reclamation plant or any water thing, you see shooting the water up in the air to get oxygen in there. So as the water comes out your faucet, it won't kill your plants. Because if the oxygen doesn't have enough water in it, your plants will rot. Well, so low oxygen levels promote root rot diseases. Of course, if there's no oxygen, the roots will suffocate and die that way. But if the oxygen levels drop below, say, 3 parts per million, the diseases that cause root rot start acting up, and then the plant's roots get sick, they get slimy, they die, and then the plant starts suffering because it's not getting enough water. So so most plants can be grown hydroponically in water. The biggest thing we see, the biggest complaint I have with the industry is they keep telling people the biggest problem with gardening is overwatering. People are overwatering. Well, no, water doesn't hurt plants. So you should be able to water, especially if it's in a pot and it's got drain holes in the bottom. There's no way the plant should ever get overwatered because the water we're adding has got plenty of oxygen. as long as it doesn't sit there too long. So if the water sits too long, if this had no air hole, no drain holes at the bottom, the water sat in here for weeks, the plant will slowly use up the oxygen in the water. The oxygen levels will then drop too low, and the plant will then rot. But it takes a long time. It takes at least, for the most sensitive plants, 2 days being submerged without the water being able to move around. And then they get overwatered. Now, yes?
I have a question. So if, let's say the water isn't very oxygenated and you're using it in a potted plant, but the soil and the roots are all, they're where they need to be, whatever I mean by that, would the plant still suffer even though the water may or may not have enough oxygen in it?
You can kill a plant if you add water to it that's too low on oxygen.
Even though it's in a pot and let's say the roots are at the level they need to be?
Well, it depends on, you're asking a loaded question there. We'll go over that as we go. But yeah, there are cases where entire orchards have been lost, like a pear orchard. We know pear trees need very little oxygen in the water, like 2 to 3 parts per million. And a reclamation plant sent the recycled sewage water to them, but they didn't aerate it quite enough, and they lost the entire orchard when they watered it. Because in those days they flood irrigated the orchard, they just flooded it with that water. The water didn't have enough air, the trees just drowned, so that kills them. So yeah, if you use the wrong kind of water, you can cause trouble. So anyway, oxygen is needed. Roots need to be insulated. So roots operate between, say, 35 degrees Fahrenheit to about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. That's when they're the happiest. And tropical plants, 55 degrees to 85 degrees. They don't like to get too cold. Some other plants can go colder than that. But in general, if they freeze, they're in trouble. If they get too hot, they're in trouble. So the root's a good insulator. The soil is a good insulator for roots. That's one of its things. Generally, in the lower 48 states, there is no soil that freezes more than a few inches in the wintertime. In Alaska, you get that permafrost, and a lot of plants cannot survive in that. But so we don't have any problem with, the soil here keeps us warm. Now, pots have trouble. So we're unique in Southern California, and we're one of the few places in the entire country that a potted plant won't freeze to death in the winter. One of the few places. Central Florida and south, the very southern edge of Texas, and south of San Francisco, generally the pots in containers don't freeze in the winter. Any place else in the United States, you have a pot and a plant outside on your porch, it's dead by December. It just totally freezes to death. So we're lucky that way. We're unlucky that the potting soils that are being sold were not meant to last that long. So that's one of the problems we'll talk about. So the soil's got to insulate. The soil has to be stable also. So to hold this tree up, the soil's got to be pretty stiff. And generally, soil, you can't move it much in the ground in your house. So that's what it does. Now, we've taken off this nutrition because for most plants that we grow, the soil is not the source of nutrition, although everybody leads you to believe that your soil has to be nutritious. They equate fertilizer with soil for some reason, whereas in nature, very few plants get anything from the dirt. Very few plants. This is their home. They don't eat their home. It provides air, water, just like your house does, insulation, stability, just like your house does for you. It's something you live in. It provides certain things, but it's not food. It's not nutrition for you. There's a few things you can get from dirt, plants get from dirt, but for the most part, plants do not get their nutrition from the soil. And that's the biggest problem we have, is that most of the amendments, the potting soils that are being sold for you to use are a better fertilizer than they are a soil. So, okay. So what is dirt? this is what a farmer would want. So we were next to an organic farm for 4 years, and the farmer told me this soil is as good as he's ever farmed on in Orange County. And we analyzed this thing, and this is like 75% pure sand. The farmers along the San Ann River have told us that their farmland is so rich they grow the best strawberries in the county. The soil along the San Ann River, almost pure sand. And that's what plants like. They love to grow in sand. Now, it's interesting what some of the ways we describe soil are. So there's 2 terms they used to use, rich and poor. Nowadays, this is totally misunderstood by the modern horticultural journalists. They don't use these terms right. But in the old days, if we're talking the 1800s, if you had sandy soil, it was poor soil. If you had clay soil, you had rich soil. So when they first started farming a couple hundred years ago in Orange County, well, of course they started far back further than that, but in the 1800s when they were farming in Orange County, the best place to farm was Los Alamitos, Fountain Valley. That clay soil, the reason why they like clay is because it holds the water after it finishes raining. No one had irrigation back then. So the clay soil held the water, held the nourishment, and that made it possible to farm. The sandy soils that these farmers love now would dry out in a few weeks after the rain was over. It was poor soil. It didn't hold any nourishment, didn't hold any moisture, so they couldn't farm in this stuff. But now, because we have irrigation, suddenly the sand becomes the better soil. So, but now the people tell you, well, they don't even know what poor soil is anymore. But rich soil, they say, well, if you add a lot of compost to it to make it, to put all this organic matter in it, then it makes it rich. So that's what their definition now of rich soil is. Now there's 2 other terms to know. Porosity and permeability. Porosity is the ability of the soil to hold water. All the journalists use this wrong. They say, oh, the soil can breathe, it's porous. No, that's not what that means. If it has porosity, the pores in the soil hold the water. Permeability is the ability for the soil to breathe, for air, gases to pass through the soil. That's the permeability. So how does soil do all these things? Well, what soil is, if you take a piece of granite, now I'm not sure if this is, virgin granite, it may be metamorphosized a little bit, but granite rock is what soil is made out of. So most of the granite's kind of white crystals. That's quartz, which when this rock breaks up, it becomes sand and silt, sand and silt. So sand in the ground are fairly large chunks of quartz. You know what sand is. You go to the beach. If you look at sand underneath a magnifying glass, especially if it's wet, it's crystals. It's just clear crystals. That's what sand is of quartz. Silt is just little chips off the sand that are the same material. And then clay, so there's 3 components of soil. There's sand, silt, and then there's clay, which are little flat flakes. The darker specks in this rock are feldspar, which is quartz associated with aluminum or iron or some other minerals, instead of crystals, it makes them flat flakes. They arrange themselves in flat flakes. So the dark parts of granite become clay. The lighter parts are sand and silt. So you grind up this rock, you get soil. That's what soil is. It's not a ground up tree. Everybody's selling ground up trees as dirt. It just drives us nutty. We cannot believe what they're doing. It's like telling a person, well, grind up some relatives and live in them. It's like, it's just not a healthy environment. If you want to grow mushrooms, you get planter mix and potting soil from another company. It grows great mushrooms because mushrooms live in dead trees. Plants do not live in dead trees. So anyway, so the way soil does this stuff, we'll use something that's large so you can see what's going on. So in this jar, the sand is represented by the tennis balls. Now, to be the right size relative to the other particles, these should be bowling balls, but I couldn't fit them in here. So the tennis balls are the sand, the ping pong balls or table tennis balls are the silt, and they're relatively round. So when you look at sand underneath the microscope and silt, they're roughly round particles. Now, if you study geometry or physics, if you have round solid objects packed together, and they're made out of rock, quartz, they consume 66% of the volume, 33% of the space between them is what's left. So when you have sand and silty soil, boy, it's very permeable. The air goes right through them. Sand is a little more permeable than silty soils because the size of the gaps also makes it easier. The bigger the gaps are, the easier the air flows through it. There's a lot of friction involved in air movement. So the silt, the particles are smaller, the air has a little harder time flowing through it, but still, silty soils and sandy soils breathe quite well. The lentil seeds in here, and they probably should be confetti, would be a better one to have in here, represent the clay. They're real small particles. You cannot see clay with your naked eye. It's too small a particle. And they're very flat. So when they pack down in the soil, the air doesn't get through there. Now, when you have a sand and silt as the base of your soil, that's 33% air in there. But what happens is that if you have a soil that contains 33% clay or more, all the gaps are filled. And at that point, your soil becomes clay soil. So it doesn't take much clay to mess up sandy soil. You just put a little too much clay in there, fill all the gaps between the sand and the silt, and suddenly the air doesn't flow anymore because the gaps between the clay are too small. So that's what makes a clay soil. It can be, it can be 70%, well, not quite, 60% sand, but if it's 40% clay, it doesn't breathe. Yes?
But if your soil is real rocky, you've got big gaps.
You have big gaps, but if you have enough clay, it'll still fill around them. But yeah, rocky soil breathes really well.
So it needs to be less than 33%.
For clay to be good, it needs to be less than 33%. That is correct, so that your soil can breathe. Now, the way that soil holds water. So if you take dirt out of the ground, especially if it's not at the very surface, you look at it underneath the microscope, you'll notice that the sand particles are covered with the gleaming layer of water, real thin layer. And the reason for that, and the silt is too, and the clay is too. The reason for that is the soil particles have a negative charge. They're ionic. They actually have a negative charge. Well, water molecules, H2O, the oxygen molecule is negative. The hydrogen atoms are positive charge. So water is an ionic molecule. These positives will stick to that negative sand particle really hard to get it off. So any particle of soil, sand, silt, or clay holds water at least one molecule thick all around it. Really hard. The only way to get it off is to bake it off. You got to have a lot of energy on that water to release its grip from that sand or the silt or the clay. So they're holding on to water one molecule thick. Other water is drawn toward it also because it's all charged. The water is drawn toward it, but that one layer, one molecule thick, is really tight. The thing about clay is since it's so skinny, so thin. See, sand may be thousands of molecules thick. They said clay can be as thin as 28 molecules thick. But it's got a layer of water on all sides of it. So your clay soils hold on to a lot of water because those particles, compared to their size, are holding water. So what we know is that if you have a foot, almost a foot, if you have a foot of sand that's perfectly dry, it would take you about a ½ inch of water placed on top to soak all that sand and totally soak it so that the water will then drip out the bottom. So the sand will hold on to about a ½ inch or so of water real tightly. Now if this same foot of soil was this clay, it can take over 2 inches of water to soak that thing through. So clay holds on to water 4 or 5 times better than sand does. Now if you have a sand soil versus a clay soil, generally it doesn't matter, your plants will do fine in both, even though the sand doesn't hold as much water as clay per foot. Because the thing about sand is the roots can breathe better in the sand. So in clay, what we're finding is that the roots may only grow down about 10 inches in clay because they can't breathe any further than that. So that top 10 inches of soil has to hold their water. In sand, they can probably go down 10 feet because it breathes so well. So that 10 foot of sand will hold more water than that 8 inches of clay. So it's a wash that way when you think about it. It doesn't really matter. If you have irrigation, it really doesn't matter. In fact, sand is probably a better soil for your plants than the clay. But in the old days, when they didn't have irrigation, clay soils were a lot better. There you can grow a crop in clay. It had enough water and to go an entire crop. Sand wouldn't be able to do that, especially near the surface. When you have young plants, if they're older plants, not a big difference. If the tree's in the ground and in a sandy soil, it's got real deep roots, it'll find that water.
But what happens when, you said in the old days when they planted in clay, but when they run out of oxygen early?
No, because they didn't screw the soil up like we do today. Okay, so we'll talk about that next. So clay is not poisonous. Plants should do just as well in clay as they should in sand. The problem we're having is that everybody is amending the soil with compost. And compost, is a decaying plant material. It's a dead tree, maybe some manure in there. It's decomposing really fast. And when it's decomposing, it uses up the oxygen. So nothing grows in a compost pile because there's no air in there. There's no oxygen. The plants can never live in a compost pile. This fungus, bacteria lives in that. And when you put it in the ground, it's like creating, how landfills operate. You put organic matter into a landfill, trash in a landfill, you bury it. What happens to the landfill? It creates methane and all these gases related with sewers. So they have to vent them and get all those sewer gases out of the ground. Those sewer gases are poisonous. They're also black. So what we know is if you put compost around, you turn your soil dark, you've just killed it. And that's what everybody's doing because we've been taught since the 1980s, the more organic matter you put in the ground, the better it is. Well, it's not true. The less you put in the ground, the better it is. So in nature, what they found when they did soil surveys over the entire world, what they found is that the soil below the surface is 99.1% mineral. That's sand, salt, and clay. That's what the soil is, 99.1% mineral. There is an average of 5 inches of, they call it duff, dead leaves and things on top of the ground. That's what they're recycling. The plants aren't doing this. but the minerals from the dead leaves and animal manure and whatever falls on top of the ground, those minerals are recycled to the plant. The plants don't do it. They can't live in it. This is the home of fungus and bacteria, worms, pill bugs, all the things that live off dead things. They live there. They consume that. The byproducts, their byproducts, feed the plants.
So it goes down, trickles down.
Yeah, I'll get into that a little bit more too. So, unfortunately, in our trade, they're telling you to put your plants in this. They're bypassing the fact that that's not the plant's home. And it just drives us nuts that nobody figures this out. Now, fortunately, I didn't go to hort school. I went to medical school. So I learned a different science stuff. And then I came back to this trade and go, what in the world's going on here? They're contradicting. You know, you take a soils class, you learn that soil is sand, silt, and clay. And then tell you to grow your plants in compost. It's like, what? How does that work? All the old soil books just talk about sand, silt, and clay. On the new ones, they have to have a different chapter that talks about growing plants in compost. And they know that fresh compost would never support a plant. It's got to be aged compost. Well, and unfortunately, they've used the term now finished compost. Finished compost is carbon dioxide and water. If the stuff is finished decomposing, it's carbon dioxide, there's nothing left. And here they're telling you this half-finished compost is what you should grow your plants in. Just because it cooled off, it's no longer 140 degrees, you can grow your plants in it now. And you get your plants and they just rot. I mean, this compost is so bad that it's, you know, the organisms that live in compost rot plants. That's their job. They're supposed to rot the plant. And you put it around your plant, it's rotting your plant. We don't get it. We just can't figure out. For the last 30 years, I've talked to people that are supposed to know this stuff. And they've been brainwashed so badly by the colleges. Now, it's not necessarily the college's fault. See, the professors are handed these research projects that they're supposed to teach from. And the research projects say this is what we read. For the 3 months it takes for nursery to get a plant growing in a pot and out to sale, ground up wood products that are composted for 3 months work better than real dirt. The plants grow faster. At the end of that discussion, they always mention that within 5 months, this is no longer a suitable growing medium. So you've got to. So their thing they said was, within 5 months in the nursery, you got to have to either do three things: either put in a bigger pot with fresh compost around that's not so decomposed. Or you throw it away, or you sell it to somebody. And that's what the research says. And I've been to colleges and talked to professors, and they tell me that I can't grow plants in dirt. I have to grow them in compost. That's their thought process right now. You can't grow plants in this stuff. You've got to grow it in compost. Yes?
Is it a monetary consideration that it's cheaper?
No. No, they're trying to do the right thing. But the research they've been handed is not right. Now, we follow the agricultural research because it's all right. The farmers know what they're doing. They have to live off the products that are growing in their soil. So if the plants don't grow right, they're in big trouble. So they know that this is the right soil. But the horticulture industry, and plants work the same in agriculture and horticulture, they're doing this to us. They're sitting in pots. If we don't sell them within a few months, they just go downhill and start to die. And we just can't believe that nobody. Now, see, California's a little different than the rest of the country. So most parts of the United States, the plants in containers are brought in around March or April. And they're out of the stores by September. If they're not sold by September, they're going to freeze in a few months. So they're gone. So they don't see anything going on. It may die over the winter. It may die the next spring. They don't have a clue. And the other thing that's going on is that in the old days, when I was a kid, the nursery sold directly to the public. We got all the feedback. We know what's going on with the plants. Nowadays, you have wholesalers that don't know anything about their plants once they leave, and they don't think there's a problem. And even the courts don't get it. I mean, when we were getting our soil, we'll talk about our soil in a bit, through the EPA, they told us this can't be potting soil, there's no compost in it. Even the EPA doesn't think soil should be, they think soil has got to have compost in it. Now, one of the things we found, there was a lawsuit in Santa Monica because they had bought all these strawberry trees from a wholesale grower that's not out of business, Valley Crest. And we stopped buying trees from Valley Crest because all their trees would rot in the pots, too much compost in it. So they planted them in Santa Monica on the streets, and they all rotted and died. So they sued the company. The state court came back and said, you can't sue them. They're growing their trees exactly how the universities tell them to do it. So they cannot be wrong. That's the state of our industry, is that it's academically driven, and if the academia is wrong, everybody's screwed. Yes.
I was told that there are some folks on Craigslist selling their yard dirt, and someone told me that I wouldn't be able to use that for, let's say, a raised garden bed, a new raised garden bed, if I were to fill it with that, because it's dead soil. Now, from what you're saying, that doesn't make any sense now.
Right.
Okay.
Doesn't make any sense.
So if I were to use someone's yard dirt, that is what this person said is dead soil, would I have to amend it heavily, or not at all?
If it's sand, silt, and clay, there's no issue. It's fine.
Yeah, I'm sure it's coming from a pretty low depth.
Well, okay. Well, if it's from a deeper depth, then it could be more. Well, around you just don't know. I mean, in some areas of Orange County. So in Orange County, the hills here are sandy clay. So there's enough clay to mess it up so it doesn't breathe as well. The rivers wash the soil out toward the ocean, so the sand being heavier falls out first. So below the hills, Garden Grove, Anaheim, Irvine, between the 5 freeway and the hills, you get real sandy soil. The soil is great. As you go closer to the ocean, the rivers slow down and the clay kind of drops out of there. So Fountain Valley, Costa Mesa, Los Alamitos, you get the clay soils. And but it depends. You don't know what's under. In Irvine, especially near the Great Park, you dig down 20 feet, it's still sand. It's great soil down deep. But on the hills here, those hills can be. You don't know what you're getting. It could be bedrock. It just could be just real heavy sandstone. You just don't know. If you can break it up, it's probably still usable because it's mineral. It's not poisonous. But yeah, anywhere near the big rivers, it's usually sand too. Even as Santa Ana River goes toward the ocean, it's still sandy along that riverbed. But now again, we need sand, silt, and clay to make a good soil. So if you have a clay soil that's got too much clay in it, you add some sand to it, and suddenly you get good soil. So don't believe those people who tell you if you add sand to clay, you get concrete. No, you have to add cement to sand to make, you can't make concrete unless you have cement. But you can, I was told by the agricultural agents that know better, any soil in Orange County, if you mix it with equal parts of sand, the clay will be good soil. There's not enough clay to mess it up after that, yes.
I have a question. So when you do the property in Fullerton, and the first growing season, everything grew. Everything I put in the ground was just fantastic. And then after that, I was told that for each growing season, I'm supposed to mix steer manure, which is what I did. Okay. And since then, we have had really bad results. Is that what happened? Is that because I shouldn't have added the cow manure?
Well, you can add cow manure, but you don't bury it. You just leave it on top of the ground.
So I was told to mix it.
Right. So, on farms, they have to mix it into the dirt because if they don't, it blows away in the wind and it goes somewhere else. So any kind of manure they add to a farm, they have to mix it in. However, we've seen them do it on a farm. They generally, if they're putting manure on the ground, it's 5 cubic yards per acre. Well, if you've spread 5 cubic yards over an acre, it's like that thick. It's very little that they're putting into the ground to make it more nutritious. So this is off the farm. They've been adding compost to this soil every year, but you can't see anything because it's such a small amount. You know, and again, when University of California went around the farms in 2000, they wanted to see how their organic matter was holding up. In 1950, the farms registered 0.9%, which is what nature does. In 2000, they said they averaged 1.1% organic content. They said that's perfect, 1.1%. Well, that's not much. I mean, you get a bag of planter mix that tells you to make it 50-50. That's lethal to most things. There's a few plants that'll put up with that, but that'll kill a lot of plants to make it 50% organic. There's not enough air left. So that.
All these years, Armstrong's been telling me the wrong thing.
Well, they don't know. Well, it's not their fault. It's our academia. They don't get it.
So that means when we put a new plant in the ground, we don't need to mix any planting soil?
Not what they're selling you as planting. So you can mix ours in, but you don't want to mix theirs in. So, you know, you don't want to put dead things that can decompose into the ground. So,
Unless it's fully decomposed already?
well, that's carbon dioxide and water.
Okay.
There is no thing, I mean, there's a few things that are safe for plants. So the farms who really know their stuff, especially the hothouse farmers, they have a much more expensive growing system, so the soil's got to be right. If they don't have perfect soil, they're wasting their money. So in hothouse farming, the growing mediums that they use to grow plants in containers in a hothouse, sand is one, but they use a lot of pumice and perlite. Now, pumice and perlite, pumice is nature-made puffed sand. So this is quartz that a volcano has shot gases through. So this is mostly air, but it's quartz. Perlite is man-made quartz that's been puffed in an oven. So this is also the same thing as sand, silicon dioxide. I mean, so basically the soil is silicon dioxide. If lightning hits the ground, you get glass. That's what plants live in. They live in glass. So these are used a lot. Now, some of the most expensive crops in the world, clay pellets. So clay holds water, but it doesn't breathe. So they form into pellets that breathe really well. They fire it into pellets. This is almost, this is great stuff to grow plants in. So the most expensive crops in the world, which is marijuana, you'll see most of them using clay pellets because it grows the plants better than anything else. A lot of hothouse farmers use rock wool. So it's just rocks, melted rocks that they weave into a wool-like thing, and they grow, tomatoes and other things in this. There are a few organic things that can be used. So for a long time, they've used peat, which is a plant that died 5,000, 10,000 years ago. Reeds that live in a marsh, they decompose below the ground. They don't decompose very fast. So when you put peat moss in the water, it doesn't really stink. It does decompose slowly. They know that they can grow a crop in here that if the crop takes 3 months, they're fine. If it takes 6 months, they're okay. Any longer than that, this won't hold up. So peat moss can be used for short-term crops. Coconut coir lasts about a year also as a growing medium. So they know that it can grow some of the seasonal crops in coconut coir. Rice hulls are 90% silica. They don't decompose at all. So they're finding that they can use rice hulls, which are cheaper than perlite, as a perlite substitute. So they can grow plants in this. They just don't decompose. One of the few plant items that last, they say it decomposes in 25 years, but they admit that there are some levees in Sacramento. They've been putting rice hulls, filling levees with rice hulls since the 1930s, and you can still pull out what looks like fresh rice hulls out of those old levees. So rice hulls are good. Holland does a lot of research on hothouse farming because their whole economy is based on it. And they said they spent millions of dollars trying to use wood and bark because they have so much of it. Europe invented the pellet system of transporting materials on pallets and forklifts. So they have a lot of old wood around that they tried to use as a growing medium. And they said couldn't do it. Cannot use wood or bark as a growing medium because they can't predict how long it'll last. So peat moss, coke, and coir rice hulls, they know what those materials do. They know what they can tell the farmer, this is okay for this crop, this is okay for that crop. With wood, they said one chunk of wood, one part of it may decompose in weeks, the other part may last years. Wood is too variable, and so is bark. They cannot tell how long it'll last. So they cannot use wood or bark to grow hothouse plants in. It's too chancy. Yet in the U.S., virtually all the plants we get from our growers are grown in either ground up wood or bark. We've heard nurseries complain that they lost a whole crop because the bark wasn't any good. It's like, okay, just stop shooting yourself in the foot. Use something else other than something that's dead. But they don't know any better. They learned from college that this is the way to do it. They cannot see their way around it. I've talked to some growers for like a half hour. One grower up north is a college professor at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. I talked to him about this. He doesn't get it. When his plant started rotting, instead of changing his growing medium, he put in bigger pieces of wood that would last longer than the shavings he was using before. It's like he doesn't get it at all. Yes?
I have a question. We have some property on my peninsula. There's a lot of there's a lot of oak trees there that are not being cut out of rivers of years. Never been built on. There's quite a leaf mulch built up.
Right.
And I've heard different people say that that's supposed to be good. Is it really or not? For planting or supplementing or?
Well, a lot of it's really decomposed far down, but no, I wouldn't use it. It's a good mulch on the surface. That's where the trees are getting their nutrition from, is that dead leaves on top of the ground. Yeah.
Did mycorrhizae ever pan out to be useful? Supposedly you could add that to your garden and
Well,
various
okay.
plants.
So, okay, we'll go over that. So that's a good point. So everybody's been told you should compost your waste products and your dead leaves and all that. That's a bacterial decomposition of organic material. Well, nature, the biggest recycler is mycorrhizal fungi. So now mycorrhizal fungi were discovered to exist in the 1950s. I guess they developed electron microscopes and they found out that most of the roots on the plants in your garden and in the nature weren't the plant's roots at all. They look like the plant's roots. They were attached to the plants, but they weren't their roots. It turns out they're a fungus that's been a symbiotic partner of plants for the last, billion years. When plants came from the ocean to land, the plants couldn't eat the rocks. This fungus could. So they partnered up with this fungus when plants first came on shore, and this fungus gathers the nutrition for the plants. In response, the plant gives this fungus sugar, which it makes its body out of. Most plants, when you look at a plant, plants are made out primarily of cellulose, and all cellulose, and that wood is cellulose, all that is sugar molecules that are rearranged so you can't eat them. And that's what wood is. It's a piece of sugar that you can't eat. Just think if you can eat it. Even beavers can't eat it. So what beavers do is they eat bark and wood and things like that, and a bacteria in their stomach breaks it down into sugar. You wouldn't want to be a beaver because what they then have to do is they poop that out and they have to re-eat their poop to get the sugar back. So you don't want to be a beaver. That's got to be the.
So the mycorrhizal fungi they just come around. Where do they?
Well, okay, yeah. Consumer Reports ran an article in the 90s saying you can, like these fertilizers have mycorrhizal fungi added. They said don't buy these because mycorrhizal exists in any soil you go to. So you don't have to add it. Now, there is some value to this. Our potting soil does not have mycorrhizal fungus in it. So if you're planting something in a pot with artificial soil, then it's nice to add this. especially if you grow plants from seed or from cuttings, they don't have any on them. So then it's good to add this to that. But to the ground, no. I talked to a professor who went up to Mount St. Helens after Blue. It's like 200 square miles of devastation that covered with ash and stuff. They said it took 5 years for the mycorrhizals to repopulate the entire area. So unless you just clear off, bulldoze a couple feet down, there's mycorrhizals in your dirt. You do not have to add them. The spores flow through the air to start new mycorrhizal fungus. But anyway, the mycorrhizal fungi take all the dead leaves and stuff, consume them, break them down, get them back into the tree where the leaves fell off of. And they said it can happen as little as 90 days. The leaf falls off the tree, the nutrients are back in the tree. Yes.
But that has to happen in the presence of moisture, right? So in California, where it's so dry, like prior to this winter, this process is not happening, right?
Well, if your plants are alive, the fungus is alive too.
Because the soil has been so dry.
Right, but it's still moist. Well, if the plant can survive in it, so can the fungus. The nice thing about this fungus is one fungus can connect the roots of your entire yard together. I mean, the first house I bought back in the 80s, I noticed that like 1/3 of the sprinklers actually worked, and I couldn't believe how the plants stayed alive. Then we read about the mycorrhizal fungus. Okay, that's why. This old house, 1/3 of the yard's getting watered, the entire lawn and all the bushes are still alive because they're all connected. This fungus connects all your plants together. So the biggest organisms in the world are mycorrhizal fungus. They said that there's one, they documented in Oregon that's like 200 yards across, one fungus plant. They eat the dead leaves. They return the broken down nutrients back to the plants. And then the plants give them sugar in return. They also share. So once your plants are part of this big system, then you just water one side of the yard or fertilize one side, everybody's getting it. So
But what you're saying that we shouldn't have to fertilize at all, right?
if you don't throw away your leaves, you don't have to. Yes.
I'm just saying that we shouldn't break our yards, we should leave them.
Correct. The plants are, they're begging you to keep their leaves there because they drop them so that they can reuse them. So they don't want you to throw those things away. And it works faster if you just leave them rather than compost them first, because that's bacterial action, and the fungi and the bacteria aren't friendly. So it's not necessary to put them. Now they look better if you put them in a compost pile first, but they actually decompose faster if you just leave them on the ground. Yes.
Do non-organic chemical fertilizers disrupt the fungi or kill the fungi?
Good point.
I've heard that, and I don't know if it's true.
Yeah, the main problem is water-soluble phosphorus. Is deadly to mycorrhizals. So if the phosphorus builds up, so if you get so I brought this fertilizer up here. This chemical fertilizer, the first number is nitrogen, the second number is the phosphorus content, the third number is potassium. Those are the big three. We'll go over that in a second too. This one's 550. The middle number is 50. First number is 5. The last number is 17. You put this on your ground a few times, you're going to wipe out your mycorrhizals. They don't like that water-soluble phosphorus. In the old days, Miracle-Gro was 15, 30, 15. Now it's not, because I think they got the message that the Miracle-Gro was killing off all the mycorrhizals, so that they were totally dependent on the Miracle-Gro for all the fertilizer. So you have to watch what you put down. So the mycorrhizal fungus are there. I'm not totally opposed to chemical fertilizers at all. The plants still use them. That's the form of, when mycorrhizals break stuff down, it's pretty much a chemical that they're transferring to the plant at that point. Just know what's going on. If you only apply chemical fertilizers and don't have any mulch on the ground, your mycorrhizals starve. They need something to eat. So, and the mycorrhizals are responsible for making the soil real fluffy. So if you have clay soil, you got good mulch on the ground, you got the mycorrhizals operating, that soil can breathe. The mycorrhizals, in combination with microscopic and big worms, make holes through the ground, so it's like Swiss cheese. So now the main problem with clay is not that it's hard for plants to live in, it's just that when we have a plant growing in compost and you put it in clay, it rots immediately if you water it adequately. So that's the big problem we have. Otherwise, clay would be just as good as sand. Sand, if you put this in sand, it's not going to rot as easily because the sand provides enough air that this decomposing stuff in here won't, like this plastic is not allowing it to breathe well enough. So this thing's rotting within here. If this was surrounded by sandy soil, it's got a chance that it can make it. So people live in Garden Grove or Anaheim in the sandy stuff, they can grow a lot of things in containers right in the ground, no problems. But if you live in the sandy clay near the hills here, or in Irvine near closer to the ocean, you put this in the ground, it rots and falls over. So the thing you do is either make the soil around here very porous, permeable, with something that breathes better. Now I had a friend who's a landscaping contractor. He made the practice, he started back 30 years ago, just putting sand around each plant. He says it works. He was smart. He was saving his plants by just putting sand around each one of them so they had a space they can breathe in.
Almost like a sand pot in the soil.
Right.
Really?
So it is keeping the roots alive. So, or take this stuff off the plant. So we have some videos on YouTube, Gary's Best Garden, that show how we remove stuff from the roots. Generally when we remove stuff, on a plant like this, there's hardly any leaves left that are healthy. You can just remove it, put it straight in the ground, it should make it. Maybe cut off the flowers because they're using up too much energy. Or you can just, any plant that's like this, like an iris-like plant, if you cut the leaves in half, then it doesn't need so much healthy roots to survive. So if you mess with the roots, take all the soil off, put it in the ground, it makes it. Other plants, if you do that, you've got to shade them at least half the day for 2 weeks. It takes 2 weeks to recover from a lot of work with the roots. In the nursery, when we were working with plants in containers, I can just take all the dirt off the plant, put it in our soil, put it back in the pot, put in the shade, at least part shade for 2 weeks, and then we bring it back out in the sun, it's fine. So get that soil off the roots, that's, if it's the wrong stuff. Now some plants don't care. Some plants can live in low oxygen levels. Lilies, majority of grasses can. I mean, this lily has two things going on, and this is a canna. It can put up with real low oxygen levels, but also as it grows, it goes sideways. It leaves this root ball. So it saves itself by just moving out of the area. So this plant has no problem. The most sensitive plants we've ever seen to compost in the ground are low oxygen levels. English lavender. You can see this little branch is turning brown. That's root rot. So even though this grower tries to do a good job, their mix is, peat moss, which is fine, perlite, which is fine, but I can see some wood chunks in there too. So that's a cheaper mix. In the old days, this company would just use peat moss and perlite. Would have worked. But because peat moss and perlite are both expensive and wood shavings and things like that are cheaper, they've gone to a cheaper mix that the company says will still work. Well, it doesn't work for very long. So this is starting to rot on us. I mean, we can't believe how little bit of this can do that, because we bought some lavenders once from a propagator that sent them in little pots about that big. We put them in our soil. We still lost half the English lavender. They just rotted out just because they had that much compost around the base of their stem. Didn't lose any French lavender, didn't lose any Goodwin Creek lavender or some other species of lavenders, but all the English died, well, half of them died from that little tiny bit of compost around, so it's real sensitive. The biggest complaints we have, the plants that people are afraid of the most, seem to be gardenias. Now, we found that once we started growing our own gardenias, they're like the easiest plant in the world to grow. You break off a branch, stick it in our potting soil, darn thing grows.
I mean, you don't even have to root it.
Well, we have to be a little careful. We put them in our greenhouse to do that, but they're easy, unless they're in compost, and they just turn yellow and die. So, one of the major companies, used to grow their gardenias right, and then they hired the new generation of growers that put them in bark, and they all start dying. So what they do, they grafted them onto African gardenias because African gardenias put up with low oxygen levels better. So they cost like 3 times as much, and they still die. If you just put them in the right soil, they don't die. It's like English lavender too. Oops. We've grown English lavender from seed in our soil. Once you grow it in the right soil, you can't kill this stuff. I mean, we grow it in a pot, set it aside, forget to water it for a month, come back and water it, it's still alive. It's really strong if it's growing in correct soil. But it's like tarragon. The book says this needs poor soil. Well, that means it needs sand. Doesn't like rich soil. Compost will kill it. So everybody loses blueberries unless they buy them from us. So blueberries, you know, the growers have been told use bark and peat moss. Well, as long as the bark is chunky, it's fine. Once the bark gets slimy, the blueberries turn yellow and die. So we've not ever, you know, we grow them in volcanic rock and peat moss, and they're very, very happy with that. That keeps them breathing forever. So, and here's a good example. So avocados rot really easy. That's the most difficult tree crop to grow. So we grow them in our top potting soil. We buy this from a grower. They put them on a rot-resistant rootstock, but they're using wood shavings in there. And these are about the same age.
Wow.
So
even if they're grafting, if the soil's not proper, then it's not going to do very well.
doesn't do as well. Now, fortunately, this is only about 5 inches, 6 inches of soil. This may not be enough to hurt it, to kill it. It's slowing it down because it's not breathing too well. You know, they have to compensate by having these pots with all these little air holes in them. Whereas, you know, we just need a hole at the bottom to drain the excess water out. It's fine. But yeah, even the avocado growers, professional growers, sometimes don't understand it. But again, it's not their fault. They consulted with academia. Yes.
If you take that tree out and take off all the soil around it and replant it in your soil, will that survive?
Yeah, we've done that with a lot of avocados. Never killed them, but it does set them back severely. Most avocados will shrivel up, drop the leaves, and then the stems regrow after 6 months. So it sets them back to work with, like gardenias. We grow gardenias because we tried to fix gardenias, and we would lose over 50% of them when we fixed them. They would still, you know, fixing the roots damages the roots, and apparently it just causes too much. A lot of fatal damage, even though it doesn't die right away. In the future, it does. So we don't like to try to fix gardenias. We just grow our own. We got these from an avocado supplier who grew them in a skinny tube with just peat moss. So that's fine. That won't kill them. Yes.
I know this isn't the topic, but since you have an avocado tree in your hand, I have an avocado tree that this year is covered with avocados. And I don't know if it will be able to sustain it. Oftentimes in other years, some of them have fallen or blown off.
It'll drop if it needs to. Don't worry about it.
Oh.
They know what they're doing. Okay, so
Follow-up question to that. The reason I asked that first question is that I have a similar situation. I bought a tree from Armstrong, and they sold me the potting soil, and a year later, it's hardly doing anything. So based on what you're saying, would it be better for me to just take it out of the ground and redo this thing?
yes, it is. Unless you want to sit there. You know, in the old days, I would buy avocados from other growers and fool with them for 5 years trying to make them grow. And just after 5 years, you say give up. And if you get it if you did a proper avocado, you should get 3 to 10 foot of growth the first year. But sometimes when we grow avocados, put them in the ground, they grow 10 feet in 1 year. It's just crazy. But usually it's at least 3. If it doesn't grow, then something's wrong with it.
So how
Well, just get rid of anything that's with wood in it, compost in it. That's
How big area, how big a diameter would you have to provide for the tree? When you plant it?
well, okay. So if you're planting a plant in clay soil, if it's sandy soil, you don't have to do anything. You want to provide, say, 4 inches of good breathing soil all around it. Now, if we grew the plant, you don't even have to do that. You just put it in the ground. The soil we have breathes so well, you don't have to worry about it. But if it's someone else grew the plant and you want to make sure it does well, then you make sure that the soil around it's very airy, and you can do that either by adding, so the soils that we created, this is our acid mix. This is half volcanic rock and half peat moss. Now see how much time I have. This is going to take a while. We're an hour in, so we're okay. So we developed this in the early 90s. I asked, we found out that the material in nature that breathes the best is pumice. That's 70% air. So it breathes the most, but it dries out too fast. So we asked the guys at UC Riverside, well, what holds the moisture for plants? They told us peat moss is the natural thing that holds water and gives plants back the water the most. So we mixed the two opposites, one that holds water, one that has the best airflow, 50-50 in our acid mix. And to this day, it works really well as a growing medium. Now, peat moss does shrink over time. That's the problem with it. So as a permanent potting soil, it's not the best because it loses about 15% volume the first year as the peat moss starts to decay and break down. So we don't necessarily use it as permanent, but for the pumice breathes so well. They say if pure clay, and we don't have pure clay as soil, but if you had 100% clay, if it was 20% pumice rock, it would breathe. That's rock-to-rock content in the clay. This is half pumice. So if you mix it half and half with any clay soil, it'll still be 25% pumice rock, which is enough to make it breathe. So we tell people, yeah, you want to use this as a planter mixer on your plant, make it half this, half whatever soil you have. It'll breathe no matter what. Now we do sell 100% pure pumice too, and then you just make it a quarter pumice, and you'll have good success that way. So we do sell that too. Now, we made a more permanent potting soil that doesn't shrink. So this soil is 2/3 inert. It's 1/3 peat. The rest of it is volcanic rock, sponge rock, sand, and charcoal. Just a little bit of charcoal. So we found out that the rich black soils of the world are rich and black because they've got charcoal content of at least 2%. So charcoal is used in filters because it sucks up all the minerals that may be good, may be bad. It sucks them all up, and it is black. And it doesn't take much. They said 2% charcoal makes the soil look black, and it's rich forever. They said it never changes. So we put 5% in here, which is overdoing it, and it drove the cost up severely. So we should have just put 2% in. Charcoal is expensive to make, but we put some charcoal in here too. So charcoal is inert, sand, the sponge rock, and the volcanic rock are all inert. This soil doesn't appear to shrink. We think it doesn't shrink at all, even though the peat moss slowly decays because the peat moss is sitting between the rocks. So it's not contributing to volume. So after a year, we see that the soil level is still the same.
So name the ingredients in the other, you said it's 1/3 peat and 2/3 charcoal and...
Well, it's mostly, the inert ingredients, mostly pumice rock, sponge rock, which is the same thing but lighter, sand, and then charcoal. Those 4 items.
But this one doesn't have to be mixed, you just use this as it.
Yeah, either soil you can put in the ground straight if you want to. The plant's still growing it fine. There's nothing wrong with these soils. They will always breathe. And you can use them as, this is our best potting soil for permanent applications, a tree or a shrub in a pot. You put this in there. Now you can use straight sand. Sand was the original potting soil. So.
Why does everybody keep saying we have to feed the plant, feed the plant? I mean, it's like, what you're saying is we can just grow it in the sand,
Well, there's no nutritional value in there, but it's the perfect place. It's the perfect for plant root health is to be in sand. You still have to feed it.
No nutrients.
Right, no nutrients
Okay.
in soil.
Now the charcoal in this mix, you're saying it attracts all the minerals?
Mm-hmm.
So does it attract the minerals and then slowly release them to the roots? Is that the purpose?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's switch over to fertilizer. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture tells the farmers what their crops need. Now, plants are made out of at least 17 minerals. We'll put them in their abbreviations here. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, sulfur, magnesium, calcium, iron, manganese, boron, zinc, copper, chlorine, nickel, and molybdenum. So that's what plants are made out of. Now, we also think silicon should be in here, but because the soil is nothing but silicon, they never had to, it's so strange. Now that growers are growing plants in artificial soil, like just pure wood, they found out if they spray silicon on the plants, they do respond better. It's like, okay, well, that's because you left out the dirt that's pure silicon. Oh, well. So we think silicon's also on that list, but that's what plants are made out of. So now carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, we don't have to worry about that. Carbon's from carbon dioxide in the air. You don't have to think about it. Hydrogen, oxygen's from water. Don't have to think about those either. So those we don't think about. The major nutrients, nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. On the bag it's listed NPK, the opposite direction, but this is the amount that they need. So let's put it this way. So if you need, for every 100 parts of nitrogen the plant gets, it needs 62 parts of potassium. Now this is a growing plant, so a baby plant, you want to grow it on a farm. Phosphorus is 16%, sulfur is 9, magnesium is 10, calcium's 10, iron is 0.7, manganese is 0.4, boron 0.2, zinc 0.06, copper 0.05, chlorine 0.03, nickel's less than 0.01, molybdenum is 0.003. So carbon, hydrogen, oxygen is sugar. A sugar molecule is C6H12O6. Cellulose, similar, just bent around a little bit. So the basic part of the plant is this. Nitrogen is the membranes of a plant. So our skin is membranes, our hair is membranes. So membranes around each cell is the nitrogen. Potassium is the salt that balances our blood. It's also the salt that balances the plant sap. So it doesn't do anything in particular. It's just the salt that balances everything. Juice in fruit is mostly potassium as a salt. Phosphorus is an energy transfer molecule. So if you don't have phosphorus, you can't do anything. So these are major. And then these are the minor nutrients. Sulfur, magnesium, calcium. Calcium's involved in wood, structure of wood. Sulfur, I don't recall what that does. And then you have the micronutrients. I mean, for years they told you put iron on your plants. It's like, you need so little of that. It was totally snake oil to put iron on anything, really. It's like they tell you to eat more iron. It's like, no, But anyway, iron is such a small amount. Now, most of the metal minerals you see, zinc, copper, molybdenum, iron, they're involved in the chlorophyll molecule. So if you don't have them, the plant's not green. So So a lot of these things are involved in that chlorophyll molecule. Almost every mineral though is needed in everything, so it's not one particular thing for anything in particular. If you're missing any of these, your plant's not going to do well. So a lot of these are either, well, enzymes and little chemicals that do things in the plant, but most of the plant is this and this. Now the safest way to fertilize dead leaves. If you don't have that, just get organic fertilizers. Like this is made out of fish bone meal, feather meal, alfalfa meal, fish meal, kelp flour, rock phosphate, potassium sulfate. So it's considered organic. The minerals in here are mined from the ground in natural form. Most of the rock phosphate is actually bird poop on an island. That's where they get that stuff from. Fossilized bird poop is mostly that. So the main thing that we don't add enough to plants in general is gypsum, which is the calcium source. Calcium sulfate is gypsum. So you can see that's one of the micronutrients or minor nutrients, but it's still needed in quite a bit. And this one we kind of leave out. I understand magnesium's in our tap water in sufficient amounts, so it's calcium we're always lacking. Now, in soil in Orange County, the only thing that we have enough of in the ground here naturally is phosphorus. So you never have to add phosphorus to the dirt. You have to add it to a potted plant, but in the ground you just don't need that number. And the other thing to know about fertilizers is the only thing here that's really volatile or moves nitrogen. So nitrogen is always on the move. It either evaporates as ammonia or leaches away in the rainwater. You have to constantly add nitrogen, whereas everything else here, you add it once in adequate amounts, it really doesn't go anywhere. So a lot of these fertilizers that have other things in them, like this is, the ratios on this 4:6:3, they load you up with the phosphorus, which you really don't need after a few applications in the ground. In a pot, this would be fine. Things kind of run through pots real fast, but in the ground, you can use this a few times. You won't need anything but the nitrogen after that, really.
So you said that's 4-6,
4:6:3.
so only 4 nitrogen.
Right, and only 3 of potassium. If it would be better if it was the other numbers. Like I've got some fruit tree fertilizers on the shelf that are 4:2:4. That's actually more accurate for us than 4:6:3. Yes. Well, no one knows. I mean, I've talked to the people from the soil and plant labs who advise the farms how much to fertilize. It's just a guessing game. So what farms do is they send samples of the plants to the labs, and the labs tell them, well, you need to add this to your plants right now, you need to add that. For homeowners, it's just a guessing game. We just don't know. Now, with organics, you can pile this on the ground because all this is dead plants and animals. It won't hurt anything.
So if I'm doing it every 6 to 8 weeks, is that too much?
You can't overdo it. You just waste a lot of money if you overdo it.
I need to keep my weeds and fertilize less.
If you use chemical fertilizers, you have to be more careful because they can build up faster. Now this is an interesting product. This Magnum, a guy made this up. This name, Magnum Rose Food. I guess he wanted to sound more masculine since he worked on roses. Anyway, this was a chemist who volunteered at Rose Hills in Whittier, and he wanted to make a rose fertilizer that matched their soil and water. So this is real accurate, even though it's a chemical fertilizer. It's very accurate on roses here because it was developed for roses here. So this is an interesting product. It works quite well on roses. Just know that you should still put organic mulches on the ground to keep your soil alive, but this is an interesting product. So he developed that one. University of Florida did a lot of research on palms. So this is a really accurate. This has got 11 minerals in 11 out of the. Now there's 3 that you don't have to think about, and there's 13 that you should. This has 11 to 13. And there's a couple here like these two. It's like no one ever adds those because they're needed in such little amounts that they never have to add them. So this has got 11 of the important ones in it. This is very complete for a chemical fertilizer. Most chemical fertilizers, like lawn foods, they might have 3 things listed. The nursery industry, for the most part, uses Osmocote. This is the most common thing that we use. My daughter she went to school, so she wanted to be totally organic. Well, she did the test herself. Does Osmocote work better than, say, the Dr. Earth stuff? These certainly grew faster. So Dr. Earth being organic does take a few weeks to kick in. But now Dr. Earth has made a new one so they can stay up with the game a little more. So they have one of them on the shelf. I'm not sure, they've been running out of it a lot, called Dr. Earth Life. What they do is they take their organic fertilizers, which are just blends of dead things, and they ferment them. So it breaks it down to simpler things. It smells like a dead rat, works about twice as fast.
What's it called again?
Dr. Earth Life is the stuff that's already broken down. Whereas this is just the blends of dead things that don't stink so much. So, we were next to an organic farm for 4 years. Whenever they fertilize, because they need the fertilizer to work quickly, it always smelled like we're in a sewer when they fertilize because they're using stuff that was fermented. So that's what the farms have to do because they need their stuff to grow faster. They can't wait for this. So they get the fermented stuff, comes in big trucks, liquid form. It's like sewage. There's
How do they ferment it?
in big tanks.
What do you add something?
No, you don't have to add much. Well, they add sewage and manures and things like that they mix together. And then they pump it through the irrigation system and it fertilizes their plants. But it works faster because it's broken down. This works immediately. I mean, the next day you'll notice difference on a chemical. Just know that chemicals can't make the soil healthy, so that you need to add the compost or mulches, organic stuff to the surface of the soil to keep your plants healthy. But we start them off with this because it works faster. And it's just easier. That lasts 6 months. If I put this in a container and we water it, sometimes the water just blows it all away. We have to do it again. So it's, in our situation, that works better than this. But generally, once that wears off, if I still have the plant after 6 months, I'll throw something like this on it. I don't want to go too long without going back to organics.
So question.
Mm-hmm.
How do you tell if a plant needs fertilizer, or is just in a poor soil?
Okay. So if the plant is in bad dirt, usually we start getting, if the roots are starting to die, you get brown tips, yellow tips, brown tips. The leaves start getting real small. That usually means it's got no roots. So that means the soil has gone downhill. If the leaves are big, it's generally, and they're pale, that's a fertilizer issue. But if the new leaves are coming out real small and everything's tipped with yellow or brown, that means no roots left.
Does that apply to vegetables as well?
Pretty much. What we've seen in all cases, if I change the soil on a plant, the new growth is huge, like twice as big as what came with the plant. So now, the guys from the Soil and Plant Lab said they're always guessing what plants need by looking at the leaves, and they hardly ever get it right. So it's hard. You just get a good fertilizer, you're okay. But in general, if you're missing nitrogen, the leaves get paler. All the leaves start getting pale. And on some plants, the center veins of the leaf turn real pale first. So like an avocado, if all the veins are the same color, you're good with the nitrogen. But if on some of the leaves, the center vein starts turning lighter, like these were fertilized back in February. So we're starting to run a little low on nitrogen on these plants, but the vein is still pretty good colored. So I'm not going to worry about it yet. But even, you can see on this plant over here, their veins are lighter than ours. I think they're just having root problems, so the plant can't get its food as well. The center veins are lighter. Yeah. So this plant's having more trouble getting its fertilizer. Root system's not as healthy.
I was reading and hearing from people that if you want to stimulate the growth of the plant itself, let's say if it's a fruit-bearing plant, then you add nitrogen, and if you want the fruit to start producing or give it the opportunity to produce fruit, you cut back on the nitrogen. And is that accurate information?
Yeah, okay. One thing though is fertilizer is not an energy source.
Okay.
So fertilizer is a building material. The plants get their energy from the sunlight. So if you just let a plant sit there, it's strong. You add fertilizer to it, it's now using its stored up energy to make new leaves. So it's actually weakening the plant to feed it. So don't think of fertilizer as being like our food. It's not the same at all. If you want to feed a plant to make it stronger, you spray it with sugar.
Actual sugar?
Right. So we found out, it's interesting, we found out back in the 80s that plants will absorb sugar through their leaves, which is really wild. We never thought that would work. So in the about the mid 80s, I saw an article that said in Palos Verdes, it was so cloudy there, they couldn't get their citrus to ever bloom. Not enough energy. The clouds were just obscuring the sun. So they found a formula in a textbook that said, oh, you can spray molasses, seaweed, and fish emulsion and really kick them into gear and get them, and this is their energy source. Seaweed is a growth stimulant, and fish emulsion is just the fertilizer, the nutrition. That combination will make the plants grow and produce. So we tried this in the 80s. I had a plum tree, 15-foot wide plum tree that was making about 5 plums per branch. I said, okay, let's see if this actually works. So in the fall, when most fruit trees are storing energy for the next spring's bloom and crop, I sprayed one branch with that solution 6 times. Every 2 weeks, sprayed that. The next year, that one branch had 28 plums on it versus 5 for the rest of the tree. I'm going, well, that worked. So then we heard that the people who grow those giant pumpkins, they said they can't break 500 pounds unless they do this. So they're cheating. So all the sugars, this is molasses, but any kind of sugar works really. What it does, it's like giving the plant an extra 5 or 6 hours of sunlight that day, because that's what they're making out of the sunlight. Energy of sunlight combines the carbon dioxide, CO2, with the water H2O to make C6H12O6, which is the sugar molecule. So I did take biochemistry in college. So anyway.
And that's a foliar spray.
Yeah, you can spray on the leaves and they absorb it. It's crazy. They absorb.
If it was roots or anything.
Well, in the ground, something different happens. It's interesting. So in the ground, there are bacteria that create nitrogen from nitrogen in the air. Nitrifying bacteria, they need sugar to operate. So you spray this on the ground, the plants get greener because the nitrifying bacteria is making nitrogen, not making fertilizer. So, yes. The ants get lazy. So ants in nature eat sugar, but they usually farm aphids to get it. So you're going to make them lazy, but yeah, we have good ant controls for that because they'll eat the sugar and become more numerous. So you do have to control your ants. So anyway, the fish provides them the nutrition to grow. The seaweed is a growth stimulant, so it kicks them in the rear, makes if you use the seaweed, everything gets huge. All the leaves get really big. That's how they get the big giant pumpkins too. They have to spray this on them constantly to make them just grow. Seaweed is the fastest growing plant in the world, so it's got a lot of growth hormones in it. So you put this on a little bit all the time, everything gets huge. So we've been doing this since the 80s because we know it works. The formula, and unfortunately I've run out of fish emulsion this week. Someone bought us out. In the nursery, we do substitute this for the fish because if I spray fish in the nursery, you can hear all the windows slamming next door to us. So we use just a good all-around chemical fertilizer. It doesn't have any smell. But if you use the fish and the seaweed and sugar or molasses, Karo syrup is the same thing. Even table sugar, it's like 1 ounce of each in a gallon of water. Spray it as often as you like. Sometimes if the plant's got real waxy leaves like citrus or the new growth on roses, add a few drops of soap per gallon of water to make it stick on better. But the sugar is pretty good at that too. Sugar makes things stick on. So most plants would probably not need that part. But we've been doing this since the 80s on our plants nursery because we see a difference. You give them a little bit of sugar. You want something to grow fast, you put the sugar on them, they grow fast.
And this is only for the plant itself? Like if it was bearing fruit, would it stimulate the growth at the same time, or is it more?
Well, see, a lot of plants can either grow or fruit. They can't do both at the same time because all the energy is going to fruit.
Gotcha.
So a lot of times if we have a plant with fruit on it, we'll spray the leaves so the plant can actually grow at the same time.
Okay.
I don't know if it really works. I haven't done control groups on that. We just spray them with sugar anyway just because we know they'll grow faster. We've heard from customers who've come from other countries, like a guy from the Philippines says they always spray their mango trees with cane sugar to make the fruit sweeter.
Oh, that's interesting.
So we know that other people do it too. Yes.
So all this is provided that the leaves are looking healthy, right? So if you have a leaf that's coming out that's small and, you know, that has a root problem, you spray this stuff on, what happens?
Still helps the plant. You're bypassing the roots to get things into the plant. So.
Okay, can I ask a question about the compost? I've been doing it for years, and so now I don't know what to do with it. I have this big compost thing made out of old railroad ties, and it's huge. And when I had a lawn, I used to put clippings in, or, you know, anything. And now I have no lawn, but I'm using different stuff from the yard that is harder to maintain.
Right. Well, it's still good for your garden.
Yeah. Okay, so and I stir it once in a while. Mostly I'm lazy and getting old. So it doesn't look very pretty, but after a while it gets really good at the bottom. You can dig it down and okay, what do I do with it?
Just throw it in your garden.
Throw it on top.
Yeah, throw it on top. It's still good.
Yeah.
It still has its nutrition in it.
And then I have a worm farm. I've had that for years. Okay, so, and I'm lazy about that too. And every once in a while I, get the bottom layer and it's all kind of wet, black and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What do I do with that?
Throw it on top of the ground, anywhere.
Just throw it on.
That's a part of nature.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so I shouldn't worry about it.
Yeah, let's
Just
skip.
don't mix it in.
Yeah, let's skip this real fast. So on mulching, so there's a farm in western Washington. So back in the 80s, they were unhappy, or they weren't sure what's going on because their farm in the middle of summer, they had an apple orchard and a regular small farm, family farm. They had to water like crazy to keep their trees happy, but they looked at the forest around them. They were green and lush. They said, well, what's going on here? So they said they walked into the forest in the morning covered with dead leaves and branches, everything soggy wet. So they decided they would cover their farm with organic mulch. So they said since the 1980s, they've had 18 inches of mulch on top of the ground around their trees. They haven't watered ever since.
Really?
So it turns out that a deep mulch layer will generate water. They saw it in Texas too. I was listening to this seminar in Texas. They were really, they didn't know what was going on. They had a drought in Texas in the 80s, and so the plants along the roads were all dead. Of course, if you've been to Texas, it's like 80% humidity there. So they chopped up the plants and left them on one side of the road. A pile, about 2 or 3 foot high, and they said on that side of the road, all the plants greened up. So the pile of organic mulch was creating water. So at night, if the air is humid, and close to the ocean here, it is pretty humid, anything that's cooler than the air, the moisture condenses into it, and it creates water. So this is how you would save water, you know, prevent weeds, insulate the ground. It does a lot of things good, but they're going 18 inches deep. That's really deep. They said what they did is they called up their local tree trimmers. Instead of having to haul their stuff to a dump somewhere, they just told them to put it in our farm, dump in the farm, and then they'd spread all the ground up trees out over their farm 18 inches deep.
So it's just,
Ground
but,
up wood.
but not compost, no.
Well, it's got dead leaves, dead stems, dead trunks, just ground up tree parts and bush shrub parts. Right,
And that can be used as mulch,
right.
but that's not fertilizer.
Oh, no, it is.
It is, yeah.
It's, you know, anything that plant is the nutrients for the living plant.
The whole point is that you don't mix it in. Just
Right,
Put it on top.
right.
So I
So-
can put my compost,
On top.
it could be, act as a mulch also.
Right. Just make sure it's not too, you know, the problem with compost, if it's too fine textured, the air can't get through there. That's why you have to turn it all the time. So make sure it's coarse or not too thick, and mix other coarser things with it so the air can get through there. I mean, I have a friend who went down to Guatemala. They want to see how deep the leaves were underneath the wild avocado trees. They said it was 5 foot deep. Of course, you know, the oak trees in this area, that stuff gets real deep too. So University of California, Davis went around the Central Valley. They wanted to see how the soil affected the plant, the types of plants that were living there. They said it didn't have any effect. So they said that, you know, you can have sandy soil, clay soil, rocky soil, soil with high phosphorus, soil with no phosphorus. They said no matter what soil that they surveyed, the same plants grew there because they essentially concluded that the plants were not getting anything in the dirt. They were just recycling the dead leaves on top of the ground. So now there's a few plants that mine the soil. So there are some plants, they call them the pioneer plants. Most of them are grasses. And some other plants like mustard. You have a cleared off field, it rains, grasses grow, mustard grow. Those guys have highly evolved roots that can mine that dirt, get the minerals out that they need. So they are the pioneer plants. You have a forest fire, the pioneer plants come in, all the nutrients are, you know, on the ground. A landslide or a flood, grasses, mustard, things in that family, the Brassicaceae, which include cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower. Their root systems are good enough they can mine the soil and get a lot of nutrients out of there, but once they turn them into dead leaves, the other plants come and take over. And then the nutrients are locked away in the mulch layer. The pioneer plants cannot get to it anymore. They disappear. The trees and shrubs come in and take over the area. So that's how nature kind of works. Now they said on this farm, they said for their row crops like tomatoes and other things, 12 inches deep.
Wow.
So they would,
How would that hurting the trunk of the tree get away from the trunk, or can it go right up?
yeah,
What about putting around your vegetables to prevent weeds?
yeah, just cover real deep. So they would start their vegetables in the container, not in the ground because this is too deep to start them in. And then they would just push the mulch aside, put the plants in, and put the mulch back. They said very little fertilizer, no water. Of course, they said they raised chickens too, so the chicken poop was doing their fertilizing for them. But they said no inputs. As a farm, they no longer have any inputs. They just, they just recycle everything. So.
Can we go back to the chicken manure for a second? It's like what we're told is when you add it, you only small amounts because it's really hot.
If it's fresh out of chicken, it's really hot. Once it's in a bag, it's been aged up to a year. So it's not that hot anymore. You don't have to worry about it as much. But if fresh out of chicken, it's almost pure chemical. It's like ammonia. It'll burn anything right out of a chicken. But we looked at, the reports we get from the state on how chicken coops operate. It's terrible. They let the poop pile up 2 or 3 foot deep before they clean it out.
No, but if we buy like a already fermented chicken manure, can that be the single source of fertilizer?
Yeah.
So we really don't need all this.
Well, in the old days, manure was the fertilizer used on farms.
But you don't want to mix in the soil, right?
Right. Just leave it on top. It works better.
Does
Works
it
better.
necessarily have to be broken down before it's applied?
No.
No, any sort of manure?
Yeah, you just have to watch out. Like cow manure is, because they feed dairy cows so much salt. Cow manure steer manure is 10% sodium by weight. You have to be careful with that one. And chicken manure, if it's real fresh, it's a lot of ammonia. You have to be a little careful with that too. But most manures are fine. You just have to watch, the disease problems that are associated with manures. So that's the main issue.
So what you're saying is introduce the plant in the soil and fertilize on top.
Mm-hmm.
Do not mix anything when you plant.
Right. Most manures are not mixed into the dirt in nature. They just plop on the ground. So that's where they're supposed to operate. Yes.
So, just for general home and garden use, you're not gonna go to 12 and 18 inches of mulch. What is like a decent level to use for?
Deeper is better.
Yeah, deeper's better, but can you get away with 3 or 4 inches?
Yeah, we figured 2 inches is kind of minimum because then that stops the weeds. If it's thinner than that, sometimes the weeds grow right through it. But if it's deep, you pretty much stop all the weed growth. I mean, weeds are the worst thing because if you water it, forgot to talk about watering. So the key on watering. So in the old days, this is not a piece of rebar, but it's shaped like one. So in the old days, the farmer's watering instrument was rebar. So they'd walk around the farm. Generally, if the soil is moist enough for the roots to get water out of it easily, you can push an object through it. And since the roots on a farm, the soil is more permeable, so they want to be able to push this bar in the ground at least 18 inches deep. So if they can push this 18 inches to the ground, they knew the soil is wet 18 inches, no problem. That's good enough water. If you can only push it down, so in your own garden, if you can push it in the ground a foot next to the plants where you want them to grow, you actually want them to do stuff like produce flowers or fruit or stuff like that, or grow, a foot is what we expect to see. And then the plant's roots are not stressed. The plant is actively growing. You get down to about 8 inches, the plant starts shutting down. So you want to make sure you can push a stick in the ground. It can be a wood dowel, even a fence post can work, but a rebar is nice. You get a 4-foot long piece of rebar and see if you can push it down a foot wherever you're watering, and then the plants will be growing. Now, the other thing to know about watering is that 2 generations, they found out that it's most efficient to water a little bit all the time. We don't know why the water district won't tell people that, but it's just crazy. They keep telling you lies like you water less frequently, your plants develop better roots.
Yeah, exactly.
No, it doesn't. They did that study 20 years ago. So they watered part of an orchard daily lightly. They watered the other part of the orchard once a week deeply, and they thought that on the side where they watered once a week deeply, they have much deeper roots. No, it turned out it was the opposite. The side where they watered lightly every day developed a significantly bigger root system, deeper, bigger root system. So all the farms have gone to daily irrigation or more. Some farms water all day long. In Israel, generations ago, they found out that if you drip all day long, that's the most efficient use of water. So some farms in California, and one farm, a vineyard up near Sacramento, they said they would now water 18 times a day. They saved 30% on their water bill.
Oh my gosh. So is this a drip system?
Yeah, they're using drip.
So it's better for the most plants?
Well, yeah, if you water a little bit all the time. Well, this is on production plant. Again, if you have a shrub you don't want it to grow, just water once a week. Just keep it alive. But if you need something to do something, make fruit, make flowers, you want it to do something, you got to keep it moist at least a foot deep at all times.
So it's better to do a more frequent, less
Right.
amount
Right.
of watering.
Right. Now, if you use sprinklers, you have to know that the ground only absorbs about 4 minutes of sprinkling at a time. The rest is runoff. So don't water. So with sprinklers, like right now on a lawn, you're supposed to be watering 40 minutes a week. Well, if you only water 4 minutes at a time, that means you got to water at least 11 times per week to keep your lawn happy. That's twice a day essentially. And you wait an hour between irrigation cycles. So 4 minutes at 5 o'clock in the morning, 4 minutes at 6 o'clock in the morning, every day, your lawn will be real happy. If you water 10 minutes, you only get 4 minutes worth. So don't water for longer than that. Just water short intervals. short cycles, multiple intervals. If you need to, you know, if you have a lawn, that's the best way to water that. Most plants, bushes, and shrubs that are ornamentals can get by with 1/3 less. So instead of 44 minutes, that'd be about, what, 30 minutes of water a week. Most production plants need the same amount as a lawn. If you have an orange tree or a tomato plant, you got to keep that thing, you know, well, as long as you can, if you maintain a foot of moisture, you're good. So just check your watering. If you need to up it a little bit to keep that ground wet 1 foot deep, that's the key. So when the soil gets dry, wet, then you start getting cracks and things. Tomatoes crack open, oranges crack open, things like that happen.
Wait a minute, what are they cracking open from?
Moisture level in the ground is going up and down. So what turns out that all fruit the plant can reverse the water in a fruit and take it out of the fruit. If the plant's dry, they'll suck the water out of your pomegranate or out of your orange and it'll shrink. And then you water it and it fills back up. Well, it fills back up too quickly, it just cracks open. Tomatoes do that too.
So it's not even.
Right. Well, if you just, like they say in naval orchards, they water 110% of what they're supposed to from August through November, because they don't want to ever run dry. If they run dry, they lose their entire crop. So they have to maintain adequate moisture because navels split easy. So pomegranate, you know, the other option is you just make sure you never water again. If you let it dry out, don't water anymore. So like pomegranate farms sometimes tell them, turn off the water once we get close to harvesting so that you can't crack them. Well, if it rains on you, you're in trouble. So you have to. So
instead of watering, let's say every other day, good soaking, it's better to do it daily and possibly more than once a day, but a lot less of an amount.
Right, you can get by with less water.
I see. Okay.
Now, too much water, again, if you don't put compost around, too much water should not hurt your plants. So like in the Central Valley, ever since we got the snowpack a couple years ago, they've been telling the farmers, you know, to help us out. You know, they have those settling ponds where they're trying to refill the water table in the ground to get it back up to normal. Well, it's not enough just to have those settling ponds. They tell the right now they're telling the farmers, just keep watering. Flood your fields, just keep them really wet. The plants are fine. The excess water will go down deep and refill the water table, because water doesn't hurt plants. It's just if there's compost in there, it hurts the plants. But if there's no compost, I remember, when was it, 98, we had like 35 inches of rain. I took my stick, stuck in my lawn 4 foot deep. I was going, whoa, we got 4 foot of water this year. That was crazy. And of course, the plants look great. They don't care.
Yeah.
They like that water.
They're so happy.
Yeah.
Does municipal water negatively affect any plants in any way because of all the chlorine and chloramines and such?
Well, chlorine, yeah, it's one reason we like to sprinkle water rather than drip. One of the reasons sprinkling is better is because the chlorine comes out, you can smell it when you're sprinkling.
But the chloramine doesn't off-gas now.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I don't think the plants like it, though.
That's what I was told that the chloramine in the water will kill a lot of the healthy bacteria in the soil and such, and will negatively affect whatever plant you're watering. So I guess a filter would be a good choice, maybe.
I don't know if the filters take it out, or do the filters take it out?
Some filters. There's some KDF medium in certain filters that remove the chloramine. Chlorine will off-gas, but chloramine doesn't. It doesn't evaporate. It doesn't dilute itself.
Well, it's probably not quite as important as removing the compost from the ground. Get that out of there, then your plants are a lot healthier, period. Let's see. I think we covered most of it. Now we need to talk a little about crop rotation. So all the nursery industry that operates in the ground, like we get our roses from farms in the Central Valley, we get our bare root fruit trees from farms in Central Valley, they all rotate their crops just like farms do. So we were next to an organic farm that was growing vegetables and strawberries for 4 years, and they told me they were on a 10 crop rotation cycle. Now it's got nothing to do with nutrition. So we keep seeing journal articles that say, oh, this crop depletes the soil. No, it doesn't. We know exactly the minerals that plants need. We know them. And all the crops need the same minerals, so that doesn't deplete it. what it does do is it puts in dead parts of itself in the ground. So like in Napa Valley, they're not allowed to rotate crops. Napa Valley, you can only grow grapes. When the grapes get really old, now when plants get old, the reason they get old is because they fill the ground around them with dead roots of themselves. So it gets harder and harder for that grape, after 30, 40 years, that grape can hardly live in that soil more. All that soil is dead grape roots. So they pull the vines out of the ground, and they have to leave the ground fallow for 10 years because they're not allowed to plant anything else. It takes 10 years, and they let the weeds grow, of course. It takes 10 years for those grape roots to decompose and be gone. And then you can plant the grapes in the same soil, and they say, oh, the ground's been recharged. No, you just got rid of the dead bodies. Come on. And I met a guy who worked in an apple orchard, and he was in college, and what he did was when they ran over a tree with the truck, it was his job, remove the tree, dig a hole this wide, this deep, dig another hole 20 feet away, switch the dirt. So the dirt 20 foot away had less dying apple roots in it. Switch with this one, then they put the new tree in there and it would grow fine. If they just put a new tree where the old tree was pulled out, it would just sit there and do nothing. And University of California, Davis did that, so they call it the apple replant syndrome. Well, in the American Rose Society found out there's a rose replant syndrome. Everybody finds out, yeah, you can't plant the same thing twice. That's why farmers rotate crops, because every crop leaves behind dead bits of itself. It's not much. It's like less than 1% of the dirt is the dead roots. But it's like someone murders people in your house. You got to get rid of all the little dead pieces. Just fingertips left in your house, they're going to make you sick. It doesn't take much at all.
Okay.
Right. If you kill a dog in your house, it's not as bad. If you kill a fish in your house, no problems. But if it's related to you at all, a monkey would cause trouble. So on plants, same thing. They just use a total unrelated plant. That's why I gave you the list that has the plant families on it, so you know how to rotate. Or you can rotate the dirt. Change the dirt out. You can put the same thing in, or rotate the plants, so that you don't have the same plant going in that bed the next year. So 10 crop rotation took over 3 years for them to do. But we were there 4 years. We never saw them put the same plant in the same soil twice, same part of their farm. Now, the farmers who plant the same crop, you see farms in Orange County, every year it's strawberries, right there. What they're doing is they're fumigating the ground. They're sterilizing the dirt, just like burning the bodies in your house, so they're not going to make diseases. So they fumigate the ground, which kills all the living organisms, including disease organisms in the ground, and then they can plant strawberries the same place every year. Strawberries are so much a moneymaker that it doesn't cost them that much to fumigate. They make, like the farm we're next to, they said, oh, we grow cabbage and beans. And the only reason we do that is to get back to strawberries, because that's the only thing in their farm that really makes money. I had relatives who farmed in Cerritos back in the 60s, and they bought each one of their kids houses because they had one good year, they'd clear $50,000, and back in those days, that'd buy them a house. So, and I think that was on 5 acres of land that they would grow strawberries on, and every year they'd buy another kid a house. Oh, wow. So strawberries make a lot of money. So, any more questions today? I've covered a lot of stuff. Yes.
I have an avocado tree, and last season a lot of the tips of the leaves were looking burnt. Someone said it was because of the salt. That's not a salt situation.
No, it's usually a root problem.
Oh, okay.
Now, okay, if you don't water enough, and the last bit of water in the ground is loaded with salt.
Okay.
So if you're running too dry, generally you have to have 5 inches of no rain to build up too much salt. There's salt in our tap water. So you need 5 inches of rain in the winter to flush the salts out of the ground. So we did during the drought years, we had problem, but once we got that rainfall, then it would take a few years to build up that salt again to lethal levels.
Right.
So like this year, no problem, we got 20 inches, so there's no salt.
I've noticed that, since it rained this season, those brown parts are gone.
Yeah, that's the way with my avocado.
Yours as well, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, with avocados, there's a different thing. There's interesting that goes on too. So they say when a lot of avocados, they irrigate with micro sprinklers. So the micro sprinklers are hitting this area here, say. And when they do that, this area stays the wettest. You get salt building up right at the edges of that. But the roots are all here where the microsprinklers are watering. When you get the first rainfall of the year, dissolves all the salt, pushes it the other way. They said a lot of times the first rainfall in the fall in avocado trees, all the leaves get brown tips because the salt's being pushed. Yeah, it's being pushed a different way than the irrigation water did it. So they said they see that a lot in avocado orchards. The first rainfall of the winter, all the leaves get brown tips.
So how often should you water an avocado in the summer, like now?
Okay, that's a good question. So the average fruit tree that's say 15 by 15, they said in Riverside, typical June day, 90 degrees in the daytime, 50 gallons of water per tree per day.
50 gallons per day.
That's how much agriculture uses. You know, they say 70% of the water stored in the dams in the Central Valley goes to farms.
Well, they do.
Ah.
Now I'm learning why.
Plants use a lot of water. Production plants use a lot of, so you got an orange, now in Orange County, we're closer to the ocean, it's more humid, figure 30 gallons. Instead of 50 gallons, figure 30 gallons on a full-size fruit tree. And most fruit trees are similar. There'll be a little differences in some of them, but if you want them to, that's per day. So I used to water with a drip system a grapefruit tree that was 15 foot tall, 25 gallons a day, every day. The ground never looked wet.
I don't think my water.
Someone was telling me that avocado trees specifically don't like wet feet. Like you water them real heavily, you leave them alone for a week.
They're from Guatemala. Guatemala's what, 6 inches of rain a year? They like it wet. I mean, Brokaw, our supplier, well, in their website says water your avocado trees when you first plant them this big, a gallon a day every summer. Second year, 4 gallons a day. Third year, 15 gallons a day. They like it wet. They just don't like standing water.
Okay.
But they use a lot of water. I mean, so the problem is if the water sits there for a week, then the oxygen level drops too low. And, avocados, I'm pretty sure everyone here has probably grown a pit in a glass of water. No drainage, pure water. The water is well oxygenated because it's clean, and it can circle around the glass fine, so it's well oxygenated, no problem. If you put a pinch of dead things in the water, it'll kill the avocado tree in a week because the dead stuff uses oxygen too fast. There's too much biological activity around dead things, like a teaspoon of mulch, compost. In that glass of water, it'll smell in a few days. The avocado roots will suffocate and they'll rot away. So that's what dead things do in the ground. So you don't want any compost around your avocado. So you go to most nurseries, they'll tell you, don't water your avocado. You're buying from here too much because it's virtually rotting in the pot anyway. I mean, we used to buy avocados from Durling Nursery, which grow, I shouldn't say the name, but they grow their stuff in ground up wood because they've been told to. We pull them out of the pot, half the roots are already rotten. We just substitute with our soil and let the plants recover. But a lot of plants come in, I was emailing a professor at UC Berkeley who was studying the problems they're having with reforestation of natural California landscapes along rivers, along highways and things. They're having a problem with root rot on all the plants going in. They said the plants we're getting from the growers are already rotten when we get them because of what they're growing them in.
Aren't they learning? That seems so strange to me. I mean, it seems strange.
The entire country is doing the same thing, and nobody gets it. It's really odd. Now I was mentored by a guy who was a soil researcher for NASA. They were just incredulous about what we were selling as soil. So I listened to him, and he says, yeah, they sent up spun glass in outer space as the growing medium for the plants. They couldn't believe what we sell as soil here, and how we grow plants. So there's some people who know, but not the right people apparently. So, and I was told by University of California I can't teach classes about dirt because I'm not with the protocol of the University of California.
Even though you seem to have a better way and you know more about this stuff.
Yeah, even though I follow exactly what the University of California Davis does with agriculture, you can't teach it to horticulture because the horticultural side is totally different and is learned it the different way, and I'm not allowed to teach it. So,
There's got to be a monetary reason
Well, it's because PhDs have big heads.
Yeah, there's a problem.
Yeah.
You can't go against professors. You know, if they got the PhD, you cannot counter them.
Apparently so.
So. All right. Yes.
Have you ever, talked to anybody about using whole house water? There's supposedly what I have in my home, which is good for inside, outside. I think it still has calcium, magnesium in the water. This particular company, but all the other minerals are taken away. For drinking. It's for drinking water, but you also use it for your irrigation outside.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, distilled water is fine. Rain is distilled water, so it doesn't have to have any minerals in it.
Oh, rain is distilled. I never thought, what? I never think of it.
Even though distilled water may not be the best for humans to drink on the regular, it's okay for plants. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah,
Today.
I hate to comment on that, but if you get rainwater and drink it, I don't think it'll kill you. It's just water. I mean, of course you're diluting the salts in your body, so you have to be. But your body knows how to regulate that. It's like.
Okay. Interesting.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and.
Thank you.